If there's one thing that gets me down at slackers, and worse than just any slacker, it's a slacker with power. The kind who wears an insignificant title as if it were a crown and goes around calling the shots just because half a dozen equally insufferable neighbors voted for them to run a neighborhood association. But the problem wasn't just the idiotic regulations about the height of fences or the color of doors. The problem was that Diane thought that everything within her reach was somehow hers, and that's how the wood thief struck. I've always liked to keep a good pile of firewood in the yard, not because I get Alaskan cold here, but because nothing beats lighting a fire and drinking a good whiskey on the veranda, enjoying the silence of the night. The pile was stacked neatly in a corner of my plot next to the fence, and I knew exactly how much I had there. So when I started to notice that the amount of firewood was mysteriously decreasing, I knew something was wrong. At first, I thought it might be paranoia. Maybe I'd used more than I remembered. Maybe the wind had blown some logs behind the fence. But then I paid attention to the marks on the ground. Someone was picking up my firewood, and it wasn't just any bug. The logs weren't scattered or bitten. They had been taken away one by one, as if someone was supplying their own private pile. That's when my neighbor Marcus stopped by. A retired detective with a keen eye for detail and a perpetual smirk that suggested he knew more than he let on, Marcus had moved in next door 6 months ago. While most neighbors kept their distance from me, apparently I'm intimidating, Marcus made it his personal mission to befriend the neighborhood recluse. "Someone's been helping themselves to your woodpile," he remarked casually, leaning against my fence with a steaming mug of coffee. Not a question, a statement of fact. "You've noticed too?" I asked. Marcus nodded, taking a slow sip. 3 logs every other night, always between 5:15 and 5:30 p.m., like clockwork. I raised my eyebrows. "You've been watching." "Old habits," he shrugged. "Once a detective, always a detective. Plus, my sunroom has a clear view of your yard. I've got nothing better to do than watch the neighborhood drama unfold." That's when I connected the dots. Diane, that woman, was always complaining about the absurd price of firewood at the market. She said that in winter, the cost went up so much that she could barely keep her sanctuary warm. And then I realized her sanctuary was being heated, yes, with my damn firewood. It was obvious. She had that way of saying that maybe it would be good to share resources in difficult times and that neighbors should help each other. But it was easy to say that when the help was unilateral, in other words, when it was I who gave and she who took. "It's Diane Harrison, isn't it?" Marcus asked, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "The HOA queen herself." "How did you know?" "She's been bragging about her sustainable heating solution at the last 2 community meetings. Claims she found an ethical local supplier who gives her premium cuts." Marcus chuckled. "Unless there's another firewood fairy in the neighborhood, I'd say you're the unwitting supplier." But now came the best part. How did I know she was the thief? Because I'm a genius. No, because the next day, as I was walking through the neighborhood, I passed in front of her house and saw her pile of firewood double in size out of nowhere. And it wasn't just any wood. I'd recognize those logs anywhere, the texture, the cuts, even the way I stacked everything. It was my firewood. At that moment, I could have gone over there and confronted her. I could have called the police. I could have made a fuss in front of all the neighbors. But where was the fun in that? This woman had robbed me and was still sleeping soundly at night, so it was time she learned a lesson. That's when I had an idea, a magnificent idea, an idea so diabolical that I shivered with excitement. If Diane wanted wood, I would give her wood, but not just any wood. I went to a plant nursery and bought a lovely present for my dear neighbor, a whole colony of carnivorous ants, the kind that, when they find a warm and humid environment, throw a real party. I bought enough to ensure that, when that thief lit her beautiful fireplace, a whole swarm of little Avengers would take over her house. When I returned home with my purchase, Marcus was waiting by the fence, eyeing the bag from the nursery with curiosity. "What have you got there? Planning some gardening revenge?" he asked. I hesitated. Marcus seemed trustworthy enough, but this plan was borderline illegal. Then again, having a former detective as an accomplice might prove useful. Carnivorous ants, I admitted, going to give Diane's fireplace a little extra heat. I expected shock, disapproval, maybe even a lecture about taking things too far. Instead, Marcus's face lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. "Brilliant," he whispered. "But amateur, you need a proper delivery system." "What do you mean?" Marcus glanced around conspiratorially before leaning closer. "Those ants will scatter too quickly when exposed to heat. You need something that ensures maximum impact before they disperse. And," he added with a wink, "you need plausible deniability." That's how my simple revenge plot evolved into Operation Ant Inferno, with Marcus as my unexpected co-conspirator. He suggested drilling tiny holes in a few select logs and inserting special capsules he'd create, time-delayed containers that would melt at specific temperatures, releasing the ants gradually rather than all at once. "Trust me," he said with a gleam in his eye that was both reassuring and slightly terrifying. "I've seen enough criminals get caught because they rushed their revenge. Patience and planning are everything." What I didn't know was that Marcus had his own score to settle with Diane. Apparently, she'd been trying to find him for his unauthorized garden gnome collection since the day he moved in. His gnomes, he insisted, were vintage art pieces, not lawn ornaments subject to HOA regulations. The next step was to make the change without arousing suspicion. I waited for night to fall, put a few logs full of my new friends on top of my pile, and went to sleep looking forward to the show that was to come. But Marcus had other plans. The next morning, he appeared at my door with a woman I'd never seen before. "This is my sister, Rachel," he introduced. "She works for Channel 8 News." Rachel, a sharp-looking woman with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, gave me a firm handshake. "Marcus tells me you've got a neighborhood tyrant problem. I've been investigating HOA abuses across the county for a special report." I shot Marcus a panicked look. "I don't think we need media involvement." "Relax," Rachel cut in. "I'm not here officially, but if something newsworthy happens to occur while I'm visiting my dear brother." She let the implication hang in the air. Marcus grinned. "Rachel's presence is just insurance. Plus, she's brought some high-quality recording equipment for posterity." This was getting more complicated than I'd planned. But I had to admit, having video evidence of Diane stealing my wood would certainly strengthen my position if things went south. And my friend, the show was unforgettable. I woke up that morning in an impeccable mood. I had my coffee with a smile on my face, feeling that slight euphoria of someone who knows that something wonderful is about to happen. And of course, that something wonderful was Diane's disgrace. I didn't have to wait long. It was a cold afternoon, perfect for lighting a fire, and I knew that the woman would waste no time in stealing some more of my wood to stock her shrine. As predicted, at around 5:15 in the afternoon, I heard a distinctive noise, the hollow sound of wood knocking against wood. I looked out of the window and, with an almost divine pleasure, saw Diane's silhouette on the other side of the fence, carefully helping herself to some more logs. She didn't even make a point of disguising it anymore. "Take it all, my child. This will be your last bonfire in peace," I whispered. Marcus and Rachel had positioned themselves strategically in his sunroom, equipped with both a standard video camera and a high-end thermal imaging camera that Rachel had borrowed from the station. "This is journalistic gold," Rachel whispered excitedly as she zoomed in on Diane stuffing logs into a designer tote bag. "HOA president caught red-handed stealing from residents. My producer will flip." "Remember our deal," Marcus reminded her. "No story goes public without our approval." Diane entered her house carrying the contaminated logs without even imagining the nightmare she had invited into the comfort of her home. It was only a matter of time before the real show began. About an hour later, the circus caught fire. It started with a scream. Not just any scream, but a desperate howl, as if someone had just seen their reflection and discovered that they had become a monster. I ran to the window and waited. Soon, the door of the house opened with a bang, and Diane ran out as if the devil himself was after her. And in a way, he was. Ants have done what they do best when exposed to heat. These little creatures go into an absolute frenzy. As Diane was unlucky enough to choose exactly the most infested logs to put in the fireplace, the intense heat turned the tranquility of her home into pandemonium. The swarm exploded out of the wood like an army on the march. They climbed up the walls, ran across the carpet, got into the gaps in the sofa, and, of course, found the owner of the house. And she ran. Oh, how she ran! She ran down the street, screaming, waving her arms as if she were on fire, her clothes stained with little red marks where the ants had already had their first meal. The neighbors, unable to understand anything, came out of their houses to see what the hell was going on. The neighbor's dog started barking nonstop, frightened by the human pandemonium that was unfolding in the middle of the street. "My house is taken. It's taken. Damn ants!" The desperation was genuine. The woman was distraught, as if she had just escaped from a medieval torture chamber. Now I have to admit, I could have been a good citizen. I could have run out to help, feigned surprise, shown empathy. But I preferred to crack open a beer and enjoy the spectacle from the balcony, like a critic watching an Oscar-nominated movie. What I didn't expect was for Marcus and Rachel to join me, both carrying folding chairs and a bowl of popcorn. "Front row seats to the greatest show in the neighborhood," Marcus declared, settling in beside me. Rachel was still filming, her professional demeanor occasionally breaking into delighted giggles. "This is better than the time the mayor got caught skinny dipping in the public fountain." She ran straight to one of the neighbors, a guy named Steve, who always tried to keep the peace in the neighborhood. Grabbing his shirt with unnecessary force, Diane started spouting disconnected words. "Ants wood the fireplace, I've been attacked." Steve, poor thing, just blinked, trying to understand what kind of attack this crazy woman had suffered. "Diane, what are you talking about?" But Diane couldn't form a coherent sentence. She just kept waving her arms around, ripping off her coat as if it were on fire while jumping up and down. Inside her house, things only got worse. The ants, now scattered, had taken over every corner of the living room. Imagine a living carpet climbing up the walls, covering the furniture, invading every possible gap. The cursed woman who was stealing from me didn't even know it, but these creatures love to lodge inside electrical systems and cracks. In other words, she could call an exorcist, but that plague wasn't going to leave easily. And that's when the second wonderful part of the evening happened, the attempted counterattack. Diane, possessed by the spirit of fury, marched back home and reappeared a few minutes later holding a vacuum cleaner. Yes, she thought she could aspirate an army of carnivorous ants. That's when I realized that this woman was hopeless. The next scene was glorious. Diane stuck the nozzle of the vacuum cleaner in the middle of the ants, trying to suck them into the hell of the dust bag. The problem? The vacuum cleaner got hot. And guess what happens to those ants when they get hot? They attack. And they attacked with a vengeance. It only took a second for Diane to drop the vacuum cleaner and start screaming again. But this time, they weren't ordinary screams. They were screams of defeat, screams of someone who realized too late that she had awakened a force of nature that could not be contained. And there I was, on the balcony, enjoying every second of that karma being served piping hot. Marcus was recording everything on his phone as a backup, while Rachel had switched to her professional reporter voice, narrating the unfolding chaos as if it were breaking news. We're witnessing what appears to be the aftermath of a serious ant infestation at the home of HOA President Diane Harrison. Sources suggest the ants may have been inadvertently introduced through firewood of questionable origin. But the best was yet to come, because just when Diane thought it couldn't get any worse, someone called the fire department, and that's when her evening was officially ruined. If there was one thing that could turn Diane's humiliation into a complete tragedy, it was the arrival of the fire department. And my friend, what a triumphant entrance. In less than 10 minutes, a red truck parked in the middle of the street, siren off, but with that intimidating presence of someone who has been called in to save the day. What the brave heroes didn't know was that the fire in Diane's house wasn't made up of fire, but of hundreds, no, thousands, of small creatures with an insatiable appetite. When the two firemen got out of the vehicle, Diane ran up to them as if they were angels sent to put an end to her torment. Her disheveled hair, wide eyes, and clothes stained with dirt and sweat made her the living picture of defeat. "They're going to kill me. They're everywhere." The firemen looked at each other, clearly not understanding anything. "Ma'am, what exactly are we talking about?" She pointed inside the house, shaking from head to toe. "The ants. My house has been taken over by carnivorous ants." And that's when I nearly choked on my beer. The tallest fireman, a guy in his 40s who looked like he'd seen every kind of disaster, narrowed his eyes as if trying to assess whether this was a prank or if there really was an emergency going on. "Ma'am, we've been called to a possible fire. Isn't there a fire in your house?" "Fire!" Diane shouted, almost in hysterics. "The fire was what I wanted. I wanted to light a fire, but now my house has turned into one hell of an anthill." The firemen exchanged a quick glance. One of them muttered something that sounded like, "I don't earn enough for this." And then, with no other choice, they entered the house to assess the scene. The first thing one of them did was open the door. He barely took a step inside and immediately turned away. What the fuck? Yes, dear reader, they saw it. They saw the demonic infestation in its full glory. The ground was practically alive, a black tide of tiny invaders taking over every corner. And the smell? Well, carnivorous ants don't just destroy wood and invade any space they can. They also give off a sour smell when threatened. Now imagine that smell multiplied by hundreds of thousands. The second fireman, who until then had seemed quite calm, simply backed away. "Yeah, that's not really our department." And me, I was on the balcony trying to hold in my laughter. I couldn't laugh out loud, but my whole body was shaking from the effort. At this point, Diane was one step away from a nervous breakdown. "Do something." The older fireman scratched his head. "Ma'am, we can try to isolate some areas, but you're going to need a pest control service. This is a professional-level infestation." "No, I can't sleep with this. They're chasing me. They're in my clothes. My God, I can feel them on my skin." And then came the climax of the evening. Diane, completely out of control, started taking off her own clothes right there in the middle of the street. Yes, the woman, in total desperation, ripped off her jacket, then pulled down her blouse, and before she could get to her bra, one of the firemen grabbed her shoulders and shouted, "Ma'am, for God's sake, stop it." The whole neighborhood watched the horror show as if they were in an open-air cinema. Some children started laughing, while an elderly couple on the balcony next door covered their eyes in outrage. But Diane no longer cared about dignity. She wanted to exterminate every real or imaginary ant that might still be crawling all over her body. "They're everywhere. I can feel them crawling up my back. For the love of God, help me." It was then that one of the firefighters decided that things had gone too far. He went back to his vehicle, grabbed a CO2 extinguisher, and without asking, pointed it at Diane and pulled the trigger. An icy cloud covered Diane from head to toe. She froze, her eyes wide as she was enveloped in a puff of white smoke. Silence reigned for a few seconds. Then, finally, she took a deep breath and shouted, "What are you doing?" The fireman shrugged. "Cooling down the room. Do they hate the cold?" If there was an award for humiliation of the year, Diane would have taken it easily. But her hell had only just begun. After a series of recommendations about evacuation, safety, and how an urgent fumigation was necessary, the fire department made it clear that her house was practically uninhabitable for at least a few days. This meant that Diane, the queen of the HOA, the woman who tormented the neighbors and acted like she owned everything, now had nowhere to stay. And this is where it got really funny, because as the unfortunate woman looked around, trying to find a charitable soul to offer her shelter, she noticed something curious. Nobody, absolutely nobody, offered to help her. The neighbors looked away, pretended to be busy, pretended they weren't even there. After all, who, after years of putting up with the HOA's absurd rules and abuses, would want to host this tyrant? Reality hit her like a brick. Diane, for the first time, was completely alone. She looked around, took a deep breath, and finally realized what she had done. And I, from my seat on the balcony, just raised my beer in a silent toast. Karma is a beautiful thing. But then something unexpected happened. Rachel, who had been filming the entire spectacle, suddenly put down her camera and approached Diane. "Excuse me, Diane Harrison? Rachel Winters, Channel 8 News. Would you care to comment on the apparent connection between your recent Firewood acquisition and this unfortunate infestation?" The color drained from Diane's face. "News? What are you talking about? This is a private matter." Rachel smiled sweetly. "Is it? Because I have footage of you repeatedly stealing firewood from your neighbor's property. Theft is a crime, Ms. Harrison, not a private matter." Marcus and I exchanged shocked glances. This wasn't part of the plan. Rachel was supposed to be gathering evidence discreetly, not confronting Diane directly in front of the entire neighborhood. "You can't prove anything," Diane hissed, but her eyes darted nervously to my property and back. "Actually," Rachel continued, her voice carrying clearly in the now silent street, "I have high-definition video evidence from multiple angles. Would you like to see it? Or perhaps the police would be more interested." The gathered crowd began to murmur. Steve, who had been trying to calm Diane earlier, took a step back from her as if she had suddenly become radioactive. If there was one thing I knew, it was that Diane wasn't going to let it go. Her pride was wounded, the whole neighborhood had witnessed the public humiliation, and to top it off, her house was still overrun by ants. She couldn't just swallow her defeat and get on with her life. No, that woman would want revenge. And indeed, it didn't take long. 2 days after the ant show, I received a notice from the HOA an infraction. In fact, several infractions. According to the official letter, my wood pile was disorganized and violated the community's landscaping standards. In addition, my fence was worn and in need of immediate repair. And to top it all off, I was informed that my property had been reported for suspicious activity. It was obvious that this was Diane's pathetic revenge. The funny thing, the HOA didn't even have those kinds of regulations. She basically made it all up and tried to use her position to punish me. And that's when I knew it was time to end this game once and for all. Instead of responding to the infractions directly, I did something better. I called a lawyer who specialized in disputes with HOAs, a guy who had dealt with this kind of abuse of authority hundreds of times and loved a case where he could put a tyrant in his place. He glanced at the notice and let out a low laugh. "There's no basis for this. Do you have proof that Diane is stalking you?" Proof? Oh dear, I had a catalog. I showed the security camera footage of Diane stealing my firewood. I showed the videos of her running mad down the street, indirectly confessing to the theft in front of several witnesses. I showed him the absurd infraction she tried to give me 2 days after the ant scandal. The lawyer smiled. "That'll be fun." He drafted a formal response nullifying all the alleged infractions and warning the HOA that if there was any further unjustified retaliation, I would file a lawsuit for harassment and abuse of power. But I didn't stop there. I found out that Diane, on top of everything else, owed HOA fees. Yes, the woman who loved to meddle in other people's lives and hand out fines as if she were a dictator wasn't paying her own bills. So I did the right thing. I reported her directly to the other HOA members. The effect was instantaneous. Diane, whose reputation had already been ruined by the ant incident, began to be questioned by her own neighbors. How could she run the neighborhood if she couldn't even pay her own taxes? She tried to make excuses, claiming that she was going through momentary difficulties, which nobody believed since she was always bragging about her cozy fireplace and fancy dinners. And that's how the final blow came, her dismissal from the HOA. Yes, in an emergency vote, Diane was removed as president. With Diane officially dethroned, I thought she would finally get the message and try to keep a low profile. Maybe she'd sell her house and disappear from the neighborhood, as any sensible person would do after such an embarrassment. But no, she decided she would sue me. That's right, the woman had the audacity to try to sue me for psychological damage and residential terrorism. What we didn't expect was that Rachel would air her investigative report the very next day. HOA corruption exposed. When community leaders become community thieves, became the most watched segment in Channel 8's history. The report didn't just feature Diane's wood theft and subsequent aunt meltdown. Rachel had compiled a damning dossier of Diane's years of HOA abuses, complete with testimony from former residents who'd moved away because of her tyranny. By the time Diane's lawsuit reached court, she wasn't just fighting me. She was fighting public opinion, a mountain of evidence, and her own rapidly disintegrating credibility. The case didn't even last 2 hearings. First, because there was absolutely no proof that I had done anything illegal. Secondly, because the videos of her stealing my firewood and then winding herself up with her own lies made the judge lose patience very quickly. Her lawyer tried to argue that I had set up a dangerous ambush. But well, how do you explain to a judge that a bunch of ants attacking a thief is the fault of the owner of the wood that was stolen? The verdict was swift and merciless. Diane lost the case and was ordered to pay all court costs, the icing on the cake. Since she was already in deep financial trouble without paying her HOA dues and now with legal debts, she had to sell her house and move. That's right. The woman who tried to make my life a living hell had to sell her beloved home and disappear from the neighborhood for good. With Diane gone, the neighborhood finally had a breath of peace. No one received made-up fines anymore. No HOA meeting was a dictatorship where only her word mattered. And best of all, my firewood stayed right where I left it. The first night after she left, I lit my fire on the porch, had a nice glass of whiskey, and watched the flames dance peacefully. Marcus joined me, bringing a bottle of 18-year-old scotch to celebrate. To justice, he toasted, clinking his glass against mine. To unexpected alliances, I countered. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire crackle and pop. You know, Marcus finally said, Rachel's report has gone national. She's been offered a position covering consumer protection stories for a major network. Good for her, I nodded. She deserves it. And the HOA board wants me to run for president, he added casually. Apparently, they think a former detective might bring some needed integrity to the position. I raised an eyebrow. Are you going to do it? Marcus swirled his whiskey thoughtfully. I might. Someone needs to make sure another Diane doesn't rise to power. He grinned suddenly. Plus, I could finally get official approval for my gnome collection. At that moment, I realized that the world was finally in balance. And the best part, knowing that somewhere out there, Diane was sitting on an uncomfortable sofa in a rented apartment, missing the fireplace that I had provided but would never have again. Because karma may take a while, but when it comes with everything.